Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into the world of alcohol.
Okay.
It's a substance that's been around forever. We've got some really cool sources for this one. Academic notes on addiction
Yeah.
and a bunch of public health stuff. So we'll be going from like the sciencey side
Yeah.
to how it affects like society and all that.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting is that we're not just talking about, just a casual drink. We're really going deep into how alcohol has shaped like entire civilizations, cultures.
Yeah.
And it still has a huge impact on us today.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start by like really breaking down what alcohol is.
Okay. So basically, at its core, alcohol is a chemical. It's made when yeast ferments sugars. And it's this process that's made alcohol so important throughout human history.
Okay, I'm interested now. How so?
So think about the ancient world. Clean drinking water, that was a big problem. Water sources were often, contaminated.
Yeah.
Bacteria and parasites that could make you sick.
So that's where alcohol comes in.
Exactly. The fermentation process actually killed a lot of those bad microorganisms. So drinks like beer and wine, they were safer than water back then. It's not a coincidence that civilizations popped up around places where they could make these drinks.
Wow, that's crazy. Kind of changes how you think about don't drink the water, huh? So how were those early drinks different from what we drink now?
Oh, they're probably a lot different. Imagine a beer that's kind of sour and not very strong, almost like a kombucha. And it wasn't just about taste. These drinks had nutrients and calories. They were important for people's diets.
That's wild. What we see as like a fun drink today was basically essential back then.
Yeah, it really shows how our relationship with alcohol has changed over time. And to get that, we need to understand how it's made.
Okay, let's break down the science then.
So all alcoholic drinks,
Oh.
beer, wine, liquor, they all start with carbohydrates.
Carbs. Oh, so that's why they call beer liquid bread.
Exactly. Those carbs, whether they're from grains like barley for beer, grapes for wine, or other stuff for liquor. Those are what make the alcohol. And there are two main processes, fermentation and distillation.
Okay, tell me more about those.
Sure, so fermentation, that's where it all starts. Yeast, which is a tiny fungus, it eats those carbs and turns them into alcohol, and carbon dioxide.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So what about distillation?
Distillation is used to make the drink stronger. Basically, you heat up the fermented liquid and collect the alcohol vapor. Alcohol boils at a lower temperature. This lets you make spirits like whiskey and vodka. They have way more alcohol than fermented drinks.
So when we talk about proof for ABV, we're
Yeah.
really talking about how much alcohol is in the drink.
Right. In the US, a standard drink has about 0.6 ounces of pure alcohol. That's like a 12-ounce beer or 5 ounces of wine or a shot and a half of liquor. It's good to know this so you can keep track of how much you're drinking.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's important to remember, even though alcohol has calories, it's not really a nutrient.
Yeah, you're right. It's actually classified as a drug, a central nervous system depressant.
A depressant. So what does that mean for our brains?
Well, being a depressant means alcohol slows down your brain activity. It affects different parts of your brain, which changes your mood behavior and coordination. One area it affects is the cerebral cortex. That's the part of your brain that helps you make decisions and control yourself.
Does that explain why people feel more relaxed
Yeah.
and less inhibited after a drink or two? But what about like slurred speech and stumbling around?
That's because of how alcohol affects the cerebellum. That part controls coordination and balance. As you drink more, your cerebellum gets messed up, and that's why you have trouble moving.
So those field sobriety tests, they're really checking how your cerebellum is working.
Exactly. They're looking for those signs of alcohol's effects.
Makes sense. So speaking of how alcohol affects us, let's talk about what happens when we drink it.
Okay, so when you drink, alcohol gets absorbed into your blood super fast, mostly through your stomach and small intestine. Then it goes everywhere in your body. Eventually, it reaches your brain.
And then your liver has to deal with it, right? Breaking down all that alcohol.
You got it. Your liver is the main place where alcohol is metabolized. It works hard to break down alcohol into stuff that's less harmful, and then your body can get rid of it. But your liver can only handle so much at once.
So if you drink too fast, your liver can't keep up. And that's when you get drunk.
Exactly. If you drink faster than your liver can work, the alcohol builds up in your blood, and that's when you start feeling the effects.
And mixing alcohol with other depressants,
Yeah.
like certain medication, that can be really bad, right?
Definitely. They can end up competing for the same pathways in your liver. So both substances can build up in your system. That can be really serious. It can cause breathing problems, coma, or even death.
Wow, that's scary. So we've got a good understanding now of what alcohol is and how it affects our bodies. Let's zoom out a bit and
Hmm.
talk about how alcohol affects society.
Yeah, I think a good starting point is looking at how much people drink in the U.S. The CDC has collected some interesting data on that.
Okay, what have they found?
Well, their data shows that a lot of adults in the U.S. drink alcohol. More than half said they drank in the past month, and about a quarter of those people were binge drinking.
What's binge drinking again?
It's when women have 4 or more drinks and men have 5 or more drinks
Mm.
in one sitting.
Wow, those are some big numbers. What does all this drinking mean for public health?
It's not good. The CDC thinks that alcohol is involved in over 88,000 deaths every year in the U.S. It's one of the leading causes of preventable death.
That's a really scary thought. It shows how important it is to try to reduce how much people drink.
I agree. And it's not just about how many people die. Alcohol also plays a big part in lots of social problems, traffic accidents, violence, family issues, even chronic diseases.
I bet drunk driving accidents are a big part of that.
They are. Alcohol messes with your judgment coordination and reaction time, so it's a major factor in car crashes and other accidents.
And I'm guessing it makes things like domestic violence and child abuse worse too?
Sadly, yes. Alcohol can lower people's inhibitions and make them more aggressive, so it contributes to a lot of those cases.
Well, alcohol doesn't just affect the person drinking. It affects families, communities, and society as a whole.
Exactly. It has these ripple effects that touch everyone.
This brings up a big question. What exactly is alcohol abuse? And what are the long-term consequences?
That's a great question. Alcohol abuse, or what doctors call alcohol use disorder, is when someone has a pattern of drinking that causes problems in their life.
So it's not just how much they drink, it's about what happens because of their drinking.
You got it. It's about how alcohol affects their life, their relationships, and their well-being.
What are some signs to watch out for?
There are a few red flags, like drinking more than you meant to, feeling like you really need a drink, not taking care of your responsibilities because you're drinking, or continuing to drink even though it's causing problems.
So if someone's drinking is affecting their work, their family, or their health, that's a sign that something might be wrong.
Exactly. And if they get withdrawal symptoms, when they try to cut back or quit, that's another big sign.
What kind of withdrawal symptoms?
Oh, it can be pretty bad. Anxiety, insomnia, tremors, even seizures and hallucinations.
Wow, that sounds really tough. It makes you realize how important it is to get help if you're struggling with alcohol.
Definitely. There are treatments that work, like therapy medication and support groups. Alcoholics Anonymous can be a huge help.
It's good to know there's help out there. But before we get into all that, let's take a step back and look at what makes people abuse alcohol in the first place.
Okay, so here's where it gets interesting. We have to talk about genetics and environment. They both play a role in whether someone develops alcohol use disorder.
Okay, let's break that down. How do genetics work into this?
Well, research has shown that genes play a big role in alcohol dependence. Studies have found that children of alcoholics are 4 times more likely to become alcoholics themselves, even if they were raised in a different environment.
So there's definitely a genetic component. But what about the environment? How does that affect things?
Environmental factors are huge too. Things like stressful life events, trauma, or being around people who abuse alcohol. All of that can increase your risk.
So it sounds like it's a mix of nature and nurture, this complicated mix of factors that leads to alcohol abuse.
Right, and on top of that, there's this new field called epigenetics. It looks at how environmental factors can actually change how your genes work, which can affect your chances of getting diseases, including alcohol use disorder.
So our environment can actually turn certain genes on or off.
Yeah.
And that can affect whether we become alcoholic.
That's the basic idea. It's a really cool area of research that's helping us understand how our genes and our environment work together.
It just goes to show that we need to look at this from all angles. The biological, psychological, and social factors.
I completely agree. It's not just one thing, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
We've covered so much already, from how alcohol is made to how it affects society. This is a pretty complex topic.
It is.
Where should we go next?
I think it's time to look closer at how alcohol affects our bodies, both in the short term and the long term.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive into that in part 2.
All right, so let's start by talking about the immediate effects of alcohol. What happens right after you take that first sip?
Okay, so the short-term stuff.
Exactly. You know those classic signs of being drunk? Your mood changes, you feel relaxed, or maybe even a little euphoric. Maybe your coordination gets a little off. All of that is what we call the acute effects of alcohol.
So it's like alcohol messing with our brain chemistry.
Yeah, basically. Alcohol interacts with different neurotransmitters in your brain, And that's what causes those changes in your mood and how you act. For example, it boosts the effects of GABA. That's a neurotransmitter that makes you feel calm and relaxed.
Ah, so that's why people feel kind of chill after a couple of drinks. But what about the not-so-fun stuff, like slurred speech and bad decisions?
Right, so those things happen because alcohol affects other parts of your brain too, like the cerebellum. We talked about that earlier. It's in charge of your coordination and balance. And as the alcohol levels in your blood go up, it starts to affect your cerebellum more and more.
So the more you drink, the more messed up you get.
Pretty much,
Mm.
yeah. The more you drink, the higher your blood alcohol concentration, or BAC. And that means stronger effects on your brain and body. That's why it's so important to know your limits and drink responsibly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's switch gears now and talk about the long-term effects of drinking a lot. Like what kind of damage can it do over time?
Well, unfortunately, the list is pretty long. If you abuse alcohol for a long time, it can affect almost every part of your body, and it can lead to some serious health
So it's
problems.
not just a hangover we're talking about.
No, not at all. We're talking about damage that might not ever heal, like damage to your organs. Let's start with the liver. Remember, that's the organ that breaks down alcohol. If you drink heavily for a long time, you can get something called alcoholic fatty liver disease that can turn to alcoholic hepatitis and eventually cirrhosis, which is basically scarring of the liver.
Cirrhosis sounds really bad. What happens when your liver gets that damaged?
Well, when your liver is scarred like that, it can't do its job properly, and that can cause a whole bunch of problems. Fluid buildup in your belly, internal bleeding, even liver failure. It can be life-threatening.
What about other organs? Does chronic alcohol use affect them too?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It can increase your risk of pancreatitis, which is inflammation of your pancreas,
Hmm.
and that can be incredibly painful. It also messes with your cardiovascular system, so you're more likely to get heart disease, stroke, and high blood pressure.
I've also heard that alcohol can cause cancer.
You're right. If you drink a lot over a long period of time, you're at a higher risk for a bunch of different cancers. Mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, breast, colon.
Man, it seems like the risks just keep adding up. Are there any other long-term consequences?
We've talked about the physical stuff, but it's important to remember that chronic alcohol abuse can really mess you up mentally and emotionally too.
What do you mean? How does it affect your mental health?
Well, if you already have mental health problems, like depression or anxiety, alcohol can make them worse. It can also trigger new mental health issues. There's a strong link between alcohol abuse and things like depression, anxiety disorders, and even suicide.
So it's not just alcohol affecting your mood in the moment. It can actually cause long-term mental health problems.
Exactly, and it creates this vicious cycle. People drink to try to cope with their feelings, but in the end, it just makes those problems worse.
This is why it's so important to understand all the ways alcohol can affect us, both physically and mentally. So we've talked about the individual consequences. What about the impact on society as a whole?
Well, like we said before, alcohol is often involved in a lot of social issues. Violence, crime, family problems. Studies show a clear link between alcohol and aggression, both in individuals and in communities.
So it's not just a personal risk. Alcohol abuse has these ripple effects that can hurt everyone.
Yeah, for sure. Think about all the costs associated with alcohol abuse. Crime, healthcare, lost productivity, the strain on social services. That's a huge burden for society to carry.
It makes you realize that this isn't just about individual choices. We need to look at this as a public health issue. We need policies and interventions to try to change how people think about alcohol.
I couldn't agree more. It takes a village, you know?
Mm.
Individuals, families, communities, and policymakers. We all need to work together.
This is kind of depressing.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to point out that not everyone who drinks has these problems.
You're right. For a lot of people, moderate drinking, when it's done responsibly and within the guidelines, doesn't pose any major health risks. In fact, some studies suggest that moderate drinking might even have some health benefits, like a lower risk of heart disease.
Okay, so there's a difference between moderate drinking and alcohol abuse. What are those guidelines again?
So the dietary guidelines for Americans recommend that if you do drink, do it in moderation. For women, that means up to 1 drink per day. And for men, it's up to 2 drinks per day.
And remember, 1 drink means a specific amount.
Exactly. We're talking 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, or a shot and a half of liquor. It's not about how many glasses or bottles you have. It's about how much pure alcohol you're actually consuming.
And even within those guidelines, it's important to know your own limits and to avoid drinking in situations where it could be dangerous for you or others.
For sure. There are certain situations where drinking is just never a good idea, like driving, operating machinery, taking certain medications, or if you're pregnant.
And I think it's important to remember that alcohol affects everyone differently.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your body weight, metabolism, genetics, even your mood. All of that can affect how your body reacts to alcohol.
That's why it's so important to know yourself
Duh.
and make smart choices.
So we've talked about the science and the health effects. Let's take a look at alcohol from a historical and cultural perspective. It's fascinating how our views on alcohol have changed so much over time.
It really is. Remember how we talked about alcohol being a safer alternative to water in ancient times?
Yeah, can you imagine having to choose between drinking dirty water
Hmm.
or having a weak beer?
Right. It just goes to show how our relationship with alcohol has been shaped by so many things. Necessity, culture, scientific discoveries. Over centuries, alcohol has become a big part of religious rituals, social customs, celebrations, all across the world.
It makes you wonder if those old traditions still influence how we see alcohol today.
Definitely. Think about the importance of wine in some religious ceremonies.
Well,
Or the tradition of toasting with champagne. Those things have been around for centuries, and they show the complicated relationship between alcohol and human society.
even today, alcohol's a big part of social gatherings and cultural events,
Yeah.
even though we know more about the risks now.
That's true. We've come a long way from the days when people thought alcohol was completely safe and healthy. Now we know that it can be both good and bad, and it's up to each person to decide how they want to use it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of alcohol, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that alcohol is a powerful substance with a long and complicated history. It can be both beneficial and harmful, and our relationship with it has changed a lot over time.
Right. We need to be aware of that and respect its power.
Exactly. Understand the science behind how it affects your body, recognize the signs of alcohol abuse, and be mindful of your drinking habits. That's how you can make informed choices and minimize the risk.
And if you do choose to drink, moderation is key. Stick to the guidelines, know your limits, and never drink and drive.
And if you're worried about your drinking or someone else's drinking, don't be afraid to reach out for help. There are resources out there, and recovery is possible.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, and hopefully this deep dive has given you the information you need to make smart decisions about alcohol.
It's kind of crazy, right? We started talking about alcohol like it was this ancient lifesaver,
Yeah.
and now we're talking about all the ways it can be bad for us.
It's a weird huh?
So what do we do? How do we make sense of all this?
That's the big question. I think the answer is education. We need to teach people about alcohol, what it does to you, and how to be safe.
So, like, giving people the knowledge to make good choices.
Exactly. We need to stop thinking of it as just good or bad. It's more complicated than that. There are good things and bad things about alcohol.
And we should probably start teaching kids about this early on, right?
Or absolutely, if we teach them about alcohol in school, they can start forming healthy habits early on.
But it's not just about kids. Adults need to learn, too.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Public health campaigns and stuff like that can help raise awareness and teach people how to drink responsibly.
What about, like, laws and stuff? Can those help reduce the problems with alcohol? Definitely. Things like making it harder to buy alcohol, raising taxes on booze, and cracking down on drunk driving. Those things have been shown to work. They can lower the number of accidents and deaths.
So we need to tackle this from all sides.
Yeah.
Education, personal responsibility, and government policies.
Exactly.
It's a team effort. This has been a pretty heavy conversation, but I feel like there's hope here. If we talk openly and honestly about alcohol, we can start to change things for the better.
I agree. We can create a healthier relationship with alcohol.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Take care, everyone.